Hi, and welcome to the panel on maximizing benefits and minimizing harms with language technologies. I am Hal Daumé. I'm a senior principal researcher at Microsoft Research in New York City. And although she's not here with us today, this panel and the topic was co-designed with Alexandra Olteanu, who's at Microsoft Research in Montreal. So just to give a little bit of context and goals around what we hope to cover in this panel. So the observation that we're starting from is that language plays a significant role in how people understand and construct the social world. And so this means that technologies that involve human language, which we'll briefly refer to as human language technologies, or HLT, which is supposed to be inclusive of text and speech and dialogue and sign language and anything that is language related, can contribute both positively and negatively to people and the social world through interactions. So we're going to talk about this from two sides. So one is the sort of maximizing benefit side. So, how can human language technologies challenge power, support, and serve individuals and communities? And also from the perspective of minimizing harms. So who is being excluded by current language technologies, who benefits, and who loses? So we have a panel of 4 esteemed researchers who have, I think, both a depth and breadth of knowledge across these areas that I really believe will lead to interesting discussion. So I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves briefly, and we're just going to go alphabetically. And first is Stephen Byrd.
Thanks, Hal. Hi from Larrakia country. I'm professor at Charles Darwin University. I've been living and working in a remote Aboriginal community in the far north of Australia over the last 5 years, where I'm learning to speak the local language Gunwingu, which has about 2,000 speakers. And I'm working on new methods for transcription, language learning, and intergenerational transmission of culture.
Wonderful. Next is Sue Lin.
Hi, my name is Blodgett. I'm a postdoc researcher at Microsoft Research in Montreal, working very broadly on social and ethical implications of language technologies.
And Margaret?
Hi, I'm Margaret Mitchell. I'm a researcher in a lot of sort of different domains and companies. Although most recently I'm joining Hugging Face as some sort of chief AI ethics something, but we're still working on the title. It's a startup, so get to choose titles. And yeah, my background is largely in natural language processing, some computer vision thrown in, assistive technology thrown in a bit, and then ethics and AI type stuff.
And last, we have Hanna Wallach.
Hey everyone, as Hal said, I'm Hanna Wallach. I'm a partner research manager at Microsoft Research New York. And my background is in machine learning, and specifically machine learning for text, sometimes social networks, these kinds of things. But for the past 6 years or so, I've been focusing mainly on issues of fairness and transparency as they relate to AI and machine learning. And over the past year or two in particular, I sort of returned to my roots in models for text and stuff like that. And I've been thinking a lot about fairness-related issues in the context of language technologies.
Great. So thank you everyone for being here. We're spanning wide time zones, and so I appreciate both early morning people and evening people for making the time. So we're going to start with discussion around sort of like benefits and how human language technologies can serve communities. So the question I want to start out with is, what are some examples of projects you've worked on or know of where human language technologies are used in the service of users or communities to make their lives better? And maybe we can start with Stephen.
Thanks, Hal. So in a lot of Indigenous communities, people have managed to make extended recordings of stories and information about families and places. And the initial focus of a lot of technology work in this space is to make transcription easier, to accelerate that process. But that really puts things into the written mode, which local people don't command. And so another language technology that may be more applicable is spoken document retrieval, where people could access the content of large audio archives in the oral modality exclusively.
Yeah, does anyone want to jump in on this?
I sort of want to speak to the framing of the question, which somewhat hilariously referred to people as users. So the question was around the service technologies in the service of users. And I think, part of the framing of sort of ethical AI work and understanding both benefits and harms is to understand that there are users, consumers, and there are also those affected. And we tend to say users when we mean people. And so just kind of like understanding the question itself and the framing there is sort of, I think, indicative of the sort of mindsets we have in technology. But, once we can sort of understand humans as people, I think then there's, a lot of stuff that can be done that is useful. So I haven't done anything like Stephen or Dr. Byrd has done, but I have worked on things like trying to predict mild cognitive impairment using the kind of language that people produce for narrative retellings, trying to describe images for people who are blind or name objects, things like that. And so in the assistive and augmentative space, there's a lot of good that can be done. As well as in sort of more like corporate contexts. But I think like the assistive and augmentative aspect of machine learning and NLP is one of the most beneficial.
And maybe I can just jump in there and talk a very little bit about a project that I worked on, in the mid-2000s at this point, so 2004 to 2007 or so. This was back when I was a PhD student at University of Cambridge working with David Mackay, who had created a program called Dasha. And the whole idea behind Dasha was that it was a user interface that would help people input text. And so it was intended not so much for those of us who are perfectly capable of sitting around and typing on a keyboard, but for people who needed other ways of interacting with a computer or a system. And what was so exciting about Dasha was that it wasn't just a user interface, let's say a bunch of words or letters that somebody would have to somehow navigate to and select either with a mouse or a head mouse or any other kind of device like that. But it had a language model that sort of powered the entire thing. And this language model would adjust what was visible on the screen based on what the person had previously input. And it's a little bit hard to describe. If you haven't heard of it, I do recommend sort of checking it out. There's certainly screenshots and probably videos and stuff around. But the language model would basically control sort of the user interface so that areas of the screen that were more probable, so letters or words that were more probable would be placed in bigger areas of the screen. And in this way, you could kind of zoom towards these bigger areas of the screen that were more likely to be the things that you wanted to say. And it was a much more efficient way of inputting text than sort of pecking out individual letters on a keyboard.
Yeah, that system is awesome. I think I remember that it would do eye tracking. So like if you looked at one corner, it would start getting bigger.
Yep, that's right. Yeah. That's right. Exactly. So there were a number of different devices that David and others tried connecting it to actually control the system. One was a head mouse. There was also a breath mouse, so you could breathe and kind of control the system. Eye tracking was certainly something that folks experimented with. Yeah, a whole bunch of different things. And of course, you could just use a regular mouse like we're all used to as well, or even a stylus. I did a little bit of work trying to put the Dasha system on the compact iPac, which was a handheld computing device that nobody remembers at this point, but we thought it might be fun to have it on there as a way of inputting text rather than using an on-screen keyboard.
I think there's like an interesting thread that connects all three of these, which is sort of tailoring the language system to cases where the users either like prefer or don't really have access for one reason or another to like certain modalities, and thinking about like how to use access in other modalities to like bridge that gap.
Yeah, I think that's right. Although I guess I want to emphasize that although we're sort of highlighting these kinds of things, language technologies are used all over the place in some, extremely mundane ways. So when I think about, for example, recently, of course, we've all been working from home and taking meetings on things like Teams and Zoom. And many of these pieces of software have built-in transcription services that, of course, have a language model as the back end. And actually, maybe even there it is about sort of accessing things in different modalities. I guess the meeting itself is all, often communicated with people speaking, and then you're sort of trying to turn this into text. So actually, maybe even there, it sort of fits your pattern, Hal.
Maybe this is the future.
I mean, there are uses that are not just augmentative and assistive. And so I feel like less inclined to focus on those because I think sort of the tech sector generally is very good at selling ideas that are just sort of like generally good for people, or they call them users. And so I just feel like less inclined to lean into that. But I mean, as someone who's worked in NLP, you can use technology to do information extraction where if you want to learn about, for example, like some longitudinal behavior around some sort of organization, then you can extract these and pull out provenance of different strings, and you can get sentiment and, toxicity and stance and opinion, all these different things where if you're trying to learn or flesh out information in some way, there's a thing called the knowledge-based population. Obviously, these tools are very, very helpful. It's very easy to do basic analysis on the Bible. I've learned that if you bring in some basic language technology, I blew away one of my religion PhD friends that I could pull out, all examples of the right hand of God and everything that was going on and stuff like that. And so it can be really useful in any sort of large research domain. And I think that's sort of a large reason why people work on NLP is this kind of stuff.
I mean, that was a big focus of my research before I moved into the area of fairness and transparency and stuff. I did a lot of work on topic models as a tool for social scientists to use to understand large document collections. Yeah, absolutely. My favorite example there, drawing on your comment about the Bible, was analyzing a data set of UFO sightings. You get some very interesting topics that emerge there.
There's another aspect of the framing of the question about users, and that is, I think, the assumption that technology is for individuals. So in places where the only device people have is mobile phones, and the local practice of ownership is that things are shared, means that you can't assume that a device is for one individual. And so maybe they'll be used by multiple people, for instance, to look at or to consume media. That'd be a popular use of a mobile device. But to have a dyadic one-on-one connection between a person and the machine is not really that common or not continuous.
How do you find that dynamic affects how you think about the technologies and the systems that you want to develop?
I've been thinking about a triangular relationship with two people using a technology. For example, a linguist sitting with a speaker using transcription software, or a linguist sitting with a monolingual older speaker and having a younger person interpret. Most of the engagements seem to involve 3 points, and looking at ways to substitute one of them with technology, or to assist one of them with technology, rather than technology ever being a surrogate for a person.
Yeah, so I want to sort of circle back to actually Margaret's previous point, which was going to be I was going to use as a transition to the next question, but there was this good sidebar in the middle. So the example you gave about, using language technology to investigate document collections or, histories of an organization or something, it reminded me of this ruling that came down in France a couple of years ago now that apparently you're not allowed to use statistical analysis on judges' decisions. Now, that's not talking about NLP, that's just looking at
machine learning.
Yeah, sort of like machine learning statistical systems. But obviously, like, the court system and everything else produces also lots and lots of text. And so I think this naturally sort of leads to this question of, how can language technologies be used to challenge power structures like the courts or like other things, or to support minorized or disenfranchised people or communities?
I can start maybe, but it will be maybe a little bit of a cantankerous sort of answer. I think I think your example, Margaret, actually is very related to some work that one of my lab mates did, Katie Keith, on kind of like automatically identifying the names of people killed by police from newspapers. And the goal of this project was to kind of aid like the work of people, humans, right, who do this manually, and it's an exhausting kind of labor. But the compilation of these kinds of databases, right, of the names of people killed by police is like a thing that is important to have because there are non-existing records by, people in power. So this was kind of seen as like one way maybe to hold power to account, right? But I also think a lot of the ways we could imagine using language technologies in this way, like to trawl through large numbers of documents to find evidence of kind of like certain kind of patterns or whatever, can be really valuable. They also kind of can sort of be powered by these logics of like quantification, right? That like you require this kind of like evidence in order to hold power to account, right? It's not as though you need to add more names to your database to know about police abuses, right? It's not that like, we have plenty of evidence about that already. So I think like for a lot of these kinds of cases, also kind of a lot of NLP for social good sorts of, let's kind of narrow the digital divide, let's, provide, let's better education, this kind of thing, like via language technologies. They're sort of like logics of quantification or logics of scale that I kind of find risky.
Hal, I think
Margaret, you wanted to say something, so go ahead.
Well, so first, like Sulin makes great points as always. I was pondering your original framing of the question, Hal, and the relationship to judicial decisions and things like that. And so I do sort of want to flag something that everyone here knows, but whoever is watching it may not know, that there's a lot of work on fairness and bias and the justice system and a lot of things that have shown that really problematic human biases with racism and sexism are reflected in the data that we learn from. And so, the French ruling makes a lot of sense, given that it's most likely that the kinds of predictions that would be made would not challenge existing power structures, but actually reinforce them. And so I was having difficulty tying your question to, I think, a little bit of the segue of what it was about, because I would say that example is not an example of a benefit. It goes into harm.
Oh, I agree.
Yeah. So that's a trickier one, but yeah, I don't know that there's much more that I was going to say there, other than maybe to say that, like, when you're thinking of supporting marginalized or disenfranchised individuals, there's a lot of utility in working with language generation technologies. And so, like, for me, a prime example is that I developed so much anxiety over writing emails because my emails were used to judge my personality and character. And there's this whole understanding of how women are supposed to talk in email. Like, if you just say, yeah, you're mean. You have to say, yeah, exclamation point, or yeah, happy face, like all this kind of stuff. And so when auto-suggest was coming out, and auto compose, smart compose, and all these things, there were a lot of people in like the bias and fairness world like, this is a horrible idea. And I was like, what are you talking about? This is a great idea. Now I don't have to like guess how to sound like a person like people want me to sound. I could just have smart compose write it for me. And oftentimes it comes up with good ideas. And so I think like there is a lot of useful things for supporting sort of disenfranchised populations, especially in natural language generation.
I wanted to jump in here too and just point out a situation where language technologies may perpetuate existing power structures, because it may involve a minority of people constructing technological solutions for everyone. And it's built on this idea that we can make people's lives better, often without involving them in the design process. And that deprives people of their agency. And in a colonized space, one of the causes of language endangerment is that denial of local agency and self-determination. So the very idea of solving social problems with technology is kind of flawed, actually.
Yeah, that was going to go to sort of a side question I had, which is, I don't know about in the NLP or human language technology space, but, more broadly, I think there are plenty of examples of technology that sort of developed with one thing in mind, but then gets reappropriated. Stephen brought up, involving the communities that will presumably use or be impacted by technology in the design and development, or possibly just not designing or developing at all, which might be the better answer in some cases. But what are people's thoughts around, how can we try to develop things that are actually useful and help empower people?
I mean, this is certainly something that we've been thinking about a bunch lately within Microsoft, and I guess I actually want to kick this over to Sue Lin, who in particular I think has been doing some really interesting thinking about these kinds of things and participatory approaches and stuff like that.
Yeah, I actually was going to say something slightly different, but I can also talk about that. I think certainly. So I think certainly participatory approaches are appealing. I think they're not a panacea. I think we, especially as they've been adopted, not in NLP, but in AI machine learning, they've been kind of adopted as a way to kind of like avert fairness related harms rather than to dismantle the relationships of power that kind of undergirds the entire process of technological development. And usually they don't come with maybe we shouldn't build this in the first place, right? So, and people have written about this, right? Mona Sloan and others have this great paper, participatory, is not a design fixed machine for machine learning or something like this. I had another thought originally, but it's escaped me. Hal, can you restate the question?
So the question was about reappropriation of technology, how things that can be perhaps designed with sort of doing good in mind can get, taken by whoever has power and used to maintain the power rather than flip it. Doesn't look like that's helping though.
No, I haven't recovered the thought. I mean, I'm sure it was a great one, but it's gone.
Certainly.
Indigenous communities are really masters of reappropriation and fix things and make things with whatever is to hand. And that's an example of people's resilience in the face of many threats to their agency. I feel that the HCI community and people working on ubiquitous computing are leading the way, and we in the language technology community could take a look at what they're doing and also maybe seek ways of collaborating with them, because they've had a 50-year history of participatory design and co-design, of democratizing the design process. And we in NLP are following in their footsteps, maybe not realizing it.
I did recover my thought. And I think it was in response to a different part of your question, which is how do we design things to actually make them useful? And the thought actually comes from the fact that I think like this is just I've been doing a lot of thinking. I'm interested in other people's thoughts too on kind of like how kind of NLP tasks are within NLP is like a research field, right? Are defined, what the boundaries of these tasks are, and how many of them in pursuit of something like natural language understanding actually map really poorly onto things that people would actually want solved or would want as solutions for things, right? And it kind of all has all come up because we've been doing some thinking on participatory design and what that might look like for NLP. But there's some settings where this might be just incoherent, right? With this PD for something like natural language inference, like which is a very kind of, it's like a classically NLP task, right? For like aimed at natural language understanding, but like it and maybe aspects of the technologies, right? The architecture or the data sets developed to solve this eventually get used in kind of applications out in the world, but it's not clear how kind of this task framing, right, supports developing technologies that help people. And so I have been doing a lot of thinking about kind of like the boundaries of NLP tasks and how they actually map on to problems that people might actually want solved, and whether or not it is even coherent to try to apply kind of like approaches or like PD to kind of how we understand and bound NLP tasks.
And I think a lot of sorry,
Hanna, you go.
I was just going to note that I think a lot of NLP tasks were chosen because they were feasible several years ago or decades ago, and not even necessarily super influenced by what people might want or might need, but more by sort of, hey, we can do this with the currently available technology.
This reminds me a little bit of, there was this paper by Amershi et al. In Kai 2019 where they introduced this term AI-infused systems to sort of try to get away from this like notion of autonomous systems or, you know, something that's going to like solve the whole task, and like really try to put the notion of like trying to use, in this case, AI technologies, but like human language technologies for us, in ways that are like directly exposed to the end user, in ways that like actually help that user rather than, you know, sort of like completely solve some task that we defined, you know, many years ago. But I think this boundaries thing that Sulin brings up is really interesting because I think there's task boundaries and there's also sort of field boundaries. So when we were talking about projects like Dasher and spoken document retrieval and you know, object detection for blind or low vision users, these are not topics that appear super commonly in the main sort of NLP or perhaps even speech and certainly like machine learning fields. And yet in some ways they seem to be the ones that are like useful, like plausibly to people. And, you know, and why is that? Like, is this a historical accident or is something else going on here?
It's also occurred to me, I'd love to hear people's thoughts on this, but it's also occurred to me that search, like you know, lives in a different kind of like academic place than NLP, which is kind of, I mean, it's always struck me as absurd given that if you ask people what language technologies they encounter on a regular basis, search is probably like one of the first three things that they would say.
So I also have kind of like maybe a cantankerous or like cranky answer. So I was sort of pausing to see, maybe I don't want to say anything, but I mean, my sense is that a lot of people don't care. I mean, it's useful to, if you're really, really interested in optimization, for example, it's useful to be able to say in a paper that this has some utility for some application. But I think working on applications, which I think sort of is a little bit what you're getting at, Hal, as well, is generally seen as kind of less than working on things that are more theoretical, or on things that are just sort of like bounded by some specific, you know, task framing like Sulin brings up. And so, you know, it's, I think, sort of a superficial interest that people will mention in passing, because they're actually interested in working on making the number get higher, whatever the competition is, right? Or making the thing go faster or whatever. And so, like, you are, I think, exactly right that although when you talk about like AI for social good and things like that, a lot of these sort of assistive things come up as ideas because these are applied uses of this technology. But when you look at the conferences and stuff and what's being published, a lot of it is around like novelty. And so if you're publishing, or if you're trying to do a system that brings together a lot of pieces for some applied context, like that's not going to get accepted because that's less than sort of. So I think there's just sort of a lack of care and appreciation of what it takes to actually have these sort of like for good sort of uses, where there really is a focus on increasing things, increasing the speed, increasing the size, increasing the number. And that's actually what people mostly care about, unfortunately.
And I think as well, building these kinds of systems that we've been talking about often involves interdisciplinary work and work that's challenging and requires people to come together outside of a single discipline. And that kind of work can be incredibly slow because you have to figure out how to work in that kind of context. It's also a style of work that ends up really touching upon the messy realities of the world. You sort of touched on this, Meg, but it's much less abstract and sort of theoretical and neatly kind of contained and bounded and manageable. It's messy, it's uncomfortable, it's difficult, stuff takes a really long time. And I think that means, therefore, that people are less inclined to pursue that style of work, particularly against a backdrop of increasingly people caring just about numbers of publications and stuff like that, and citation counts and all of these kinds of things. I've long said that interdisciplinary work is not a good way to boost one's citation count or number of papers. If anything, it's a great way to sort of slow these things down because it's so hard to do and to get right, and it just takes a long time.
I think there's this tokenistic way that people refer to the social benefits of their research as part of a narrative that's developed but not incorporated into the evaluation. And since our field is proud about our evaluation rigour, I feel like these ambit claims that are made about the social good of the technology ought to be subject to some sort of evaluation as well.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I also think because we really value maybe in the pursuit of NLU or something, right? Like work nominally in the pursuit of NLU, work that is abstracted away from deployment settings, it means that we end up knowing so little about the harms that these things actually give rise to, right? We know that they're probably going to, you can look at what the task is or what the system is and say, almost without, with some certainty, something will happen that is not great when you deploy this in a real setting. But because they never get deployed in real settings by academics, right? We don't know. And so we're left to kind of speculate and say, like, probably this is going to be terrible for someone or lots of someone's, but we just don't know. And I kind of I've been finding it like shocking and kind of disappointing that a lot of the cases of these systems gone wrong, I find out from journalistic endeavors, right? And not because we're writing about it and publishing about it and talking about it in our communities, but because some journalist is like, hey, did you know this machine translation system is being used in an immigration court? And you're like, oh my, and you're like, no.
So I think we've slightly, slowly segued over to harms anyway. So let's officially segue over to harms. So we've talked about this actually a little bit already, but I wanted to talk about sort of inclusion. The technologies that we're talking about, generally speaking, are being built by a pretty narrow segment of the world population, but often sort of expected or, imagined to serve a much broader population. And so, it may be like specific examples could be useful here for cases where, you can think of certain people or certain communities being excluded by current language technology practices. And then we've talked about participatory design and related things, but, are there other forms of inclusion that are meaningful and not sort of like ethics washing?
I think there's a lot of very obvious ways in which our practices exclude lots of people across the pipeline, and I think a lot of other people can speak to that. So maybe I'll not talk about that to start with. I think I was thinking, kind of piggybacking off of what we were just talking about, right? The kind of work that we routinely exclude from NLP kind of research. So I think we exclude a lot of slow work. So Emily Bender's talked a lot about this and other people. So I think NLP research and practice, even when they are interested in measuring harm or other social impacts, really only tend to inspect system behavior, abstract away from deployment settings. And I think if we want to uncover the impacts of these technologies or how these technologies are actually produced, we need methods beyond what we are employing, right? Often interdisciplinary kinds of approaches from different disciplines, like Hannah's been talking about. So like qualitative methods or interviews or participatory approaches. And what we're doing right now is like where you kind of poke a system behavior and say that you know how your system is biased or something like this, right? Can't possibly uncover people's really subjective or lived experiences with technology or the beliefs and practices and organizational dynamics that actually create these technologies. So all this stuff takes time, and there are methods that aren't used in NLP and produces, probably less flashy or generalizable work or something like this because it's context dependent, so we don't reward it. So I kind of I worry a lot about this kind of work, and I think it's a shame that we're not taking advantage of kind of the kind of many methods and approaches that are available to us to really kind of uncover what language technologies are like, what they look like in the world, how they're produced.
Most of the world's languages are oral, and these are oral cultures. People command a repertoire of languages and switch between them for different functions where they are. And so language technologies which presume text and then which presume normalized, standardized text have this unfortunate consequence of reinforcing the frame that, high prestige cultures are the ones with written records. When you tell people who are writing, oh, there's an orthography standard now and you should write in the standard way, the unintended consequence is that people write less because they know there's a right way and they know they don't know it. So one remedy, I think, is for to continue this acceleration of interest in spoken language technologies and to focus not on language technologies for all so much as looking at the regional varieties of major world languages, which are spoken by every remote person who is, multilingual, but they still need to work in the wider world. And when they phone that banking system or hotel booking system, if they've got charge in their phone and so on, they're not going to speak in their local indigenous language. They'll speak in their regional variety. And this is really not well supported by speech technologies yet. And that would be such an empowering thing to do.
Yeah. I think, inclusion is, not just limited to who's using the technology and who's affected by the technology, but also obviously the people at the table from the start who are defining what the technology is. And I think probably Sue Lin first was sort of hitting on that. But, I wanted to focus on this point because I see inclusion within tech creation circles as being one of the most fundamental problems in AI right now. The fact that you can have some sort of diversity by hiring people who you see as below you, but then you can't retain them because they're alienated, right? So you end up with the same, subpopulation working on work for, all over the world. And so I just really wanted to highlight that one of the big barriers to moving forward responsible AI down well-informed paths is because largely inclusion is not really done. People don't understand what inclusion is. It means that, if you feel threatened, that doesn't mean you're being threatened. If you feel attacked, that doesn't mean you're being attacked, right? So like communication styles for different people at the table are going to be very different depending on their cultures and, how they've been raised and things like that. And if you are basically implicitly or explicitly like putting forward a norm of behavior and communication style, then you're going to alienate most of the people who could come and diversify the kinds of problems that are being looked at. And I think that this is like one of the things that is hard for people in machine learning or NLP to really dig into because it's not seen as a technical problem, but it still is fundamental to what kind of work gets done. Minimally, because if you have a good idea and you're from a marginalized population, you tend to have to kind of fight for it as opposed to just being able to say it. And fighting is exhausting, and also it makes people like you less, right? So, if you can't share an idea without having to couch it in a very certain way that conforms to some norms that other people wrote, then you're not going to be able to, make cool decisions with other people. And that means the technology is going to be reflecting a very myopic view of what should be done and how the world works.
Yeah, I want to be mindful of time, so we've got about 5 minutes left. So I want to switch on to the last question, which is I want to give everyone 1 minute to tell everyone who's watching, what would your one piece of advice be that you could give to someone working in the area of human language technologies about how to do better research or how to build better tools or systems? What would that piece of advice be? And maybe we'll go reverse alphabetical. So we'll start with Hanna.
Yeah, okay, this is tough because I have so many pieces of advice that I want to give and very limited time here. But I think the biggest one for me comes down to this. You're not going to develop systems that are responsible, that treat people fairly, that behave in all of these ways that we want, if you build your system without thinking about all of these things, and then turn around sometime before or maybe even after deployment and say, what can we do now? How can we now try and somehow make this system fair? And so for me, it really comes down to changing our development practices to prioritize things like fairness, things like inclusion from day number one. I really strongly +1 Meg's point about if you don't have an inclusive culture on the development team, you're not going to build products that are inclusive. And so my number one piece of advice really is start thinking about these things from that very first second. Don't wait until you're about to ship it.
Great. And Margaret?
So I think one piece of advice that might be quick is the sort of quality over quantity thing. So people try and publish a lot and look at number of papers, but if you can sort of have the courage to nurture your work, then that might be less papers, but the papers will be more impactful. Or, go on a roadshow and show people the cool thing you're doing instead of just focusing on publishing more papers. Like really dig into what you're doing and nurture that further is a really great way of standing out in the research world and having people know what you're up to.
Sulin?
Yeah, I think I'd say if you're building a system or you're thinking about building a system, think about all the assumptions that you've made kind of like at every point in the pipeline, like at, whatever you're doing, you have implicitly or explicitly made decisions, right, about what the problem is. And so, should you build the thing and who is it for and who does it serve and whose language is relevant or which stakeholders are relevant for you to consider and whose perspectives are you foregrounding when you annotate and what kinds of system behavior are you rewarding via evaluation and all these kinds of things, right? You've made all these decisions. And so I would say always be thinking about what kinds of assumptions about language, about speakers, about stakeholders, you are being kind of operationalized or kind of leaned on when you're making these decisions.
And Stephen?
Just to embrace oral culture that surrounds us and to decenter our design practices.
This has been great. Thank you all so much for taking this time to share your expertise with me and with everyone else. And I said this at the beginning, but I want to thank again Alexandra Olteanu, who's at Microsoft Research in Montreal, for helping come up with the idea of this panel and workshop questions and stuff like that. This definitely wouldn't have happened without her help. And with that, thank you again to all four of you. This has been wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you, Hal and Alexandra.
Thank you.